would like to ask Khenpo, now just from the perspective of Buddhist doctrine, could you explain how we should view the reincarnation of Tulkus? Isn't it true that each of us is also a result of reincarnation? That's my question, if you don't mind. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Everyone is a Tulku. You could certainly put it that way, as some might say. The so-called Tulku is, in reality, a term that was added by people later on. In the true sense of Tibetan Buddhism, Tulkus are called reincarnated beings. That's what it means. It doesn't mean they are literally living Buddhas. That's not the meaning. Because nowadays many people are especially fond of Tulkus. They think that an actual Buddha has arrived. It might seem that way, but in fact it means a reincarnated being. There are different levels of such reincarnated beings in Tibetan Buddhism. Some people who have practiced especially well, if they are willing to remain in samsara and wish to help sentient beings, then before they pass away, they make certain important vows, recite some meaningful mantras, and practice detailed visualizations, and so on. For example, if you want to become someone with greater abilities in the future, you visualize yourself entering the womb as the syllable hum. If you truly want to become a wise person, you should visualize yourself gently entering the womb as the luminous syllable di. If you wish to become a deeply compassionate person in the future, then the syllable is shri. In Tibetan, there are different syllables used for various visualizations. So when you pass away with such a purposeful intention, after you leave this world, you can perhaps eventually be reborn in the future. On one hand, some people wonder why there are Tulkus in Tibetan Buddhism, but not in Chinese Han Buddhism or other traditions. Actually, that's not true. There are Tulkus in the US and Han area too. There are Tulkus in many places. Moreover, in a broader sense, everyone is a reincarnation. Everyone is a reincarnated Tulku, according to the Buddhist perspective. Maybe I was an ox in a previous life, and today I have become a human, so I'm also the Tulku of the ox. There can be Tulkus of oxen, horses, and humans. They can all exist and be reincarnated. But what Tibetan Buddhism now calls true eminent monks and great masters, they consciously engaged in necessary visualizations and meditative practices in previous lives. And upon completing these practices, they are reborn in their next life. These people truly and indeed possess some particularly wondrous and remarkable qualities. The valuable habits, deep-rooted wisdom, and genuine sense of compassion that are carried over from their previous lives can all be naturally manifested in them. Of course, not everyone is necessarily really like this. Because nowadays there are some individuals who may have all sorts of different factors involved for a variety of different reasons. They may not actually be a true Tulku from a previous life, but because of their family background or for various other reasons, people insist on giving them the title of Tulku. Although such cases do exist in today's market, and I also do not deny that true Tulkus actually do exist, many of the reincarnated Tulkus whom I have personally met in my life are surely indeed remarkable. Their wisdom and compassion are not just from this lifetime. Some truly extraordinary and remarkable phenomena can also quite often be seen in them. For example, this time when I went to Qinghai to attend a seminar on Tibetan Buddhism, at that seminar they told me many fascinating stories from the Epic of King Gesar. Typically one story in the Epic of King Gesar is about the length of a book, but there are some people who can recite more than 40 of these biographies, memorizing all of them entirely by heart, even though they are not able to read a single word of text. Many of the dedicated members of the editorial team, some of them have produced written versions, including Jampel Gyatso from your Academy of Social Sciences, who has specialized research in this area as well. So whether it's the long-term memory involved in the Epic of King Gesar, certain important aspects of their consciousness, most people indeed, without some accumulation from a previous life or something special. This is something that ordinary science probably can't explain clearly. This actually should require a specific kind of deep Buddhist knowledge of reincarnation to fully explain it. That's exactly the way it is said it should be understood.
So, when it comes to reincarnation, according to Buddhist theory, it's basically his own power of aspiration, which is then combined with his very subtle and stable consciousness. You need to have both of these things. Is it only with both that reincarnation can succeed? Or how exactly should this be explained?
He should be a truly accomplished and highly skilled practitioner so that he can successfully and smoothly reincarnate into a new life.
So each of us is also reincarnated.
Right, but for each of us, making a vow doesn't mean we'll succeed.
It doesn't necessarily always succeed, right? But in those Buddhist scriptures, which scriptures specifically talk about the basis for this kind of reincarnation, are there such teachings?
You want to reincarnate, is that it?
Yes, I really want to come back again in the future.
It's like this. The reasoning on this topic, as we begin to consider it, first of all, in Buddhism, for example, in Padmasambhava's Bardo teachings, the practice I just mentioned, and also, as I just said earlier, in the esoteric teachings of the omniscient Longchenpa, as I've already explained, there are also visualizations in Lama Yangti. Moreover, many of these classic texts also quote quite extensively from various exoteric scriptures. In exoteric Buddhism, this is often referred to as the supreme emanation. A supreme emanation is not just a reincarnated person. They can, in fact, reincarnate as all kinds of sentient beings. In the Nyingma tradition, there is a very famous figure whose treatises are now especially renowned in the world and within Tibetan Buddhism. Even now, many scholars in the UK and the US are particularly focused on his works. This is Mipham Rinpoche, a highly respected and renowned Buddhist master. He was already composing detailed philosophical treatises at the remarkably young age of just 7 years old. When he later passed away, he said, "In my next life, I will become an animal. I will not immediately become a human being." He had confidence in his own ability to successfully reincarnate.
Hello, Master. I am a graduate student at the Institute of World Religions Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. My major is Chinese Han Buddhism. Although my own field of study is Chinese Han Buddhism, I am very interested in researching Buddhism as a whole. I am very interested in conducting research on Buddhism as a whole. Currently, among Han Chinese, it is also quite common for people to accept and practice Tibetan Buddhism. What I would like to ask you, Master, is that since you have studied both Chinese Han Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism from a historical perspective, after all, Chinese Han Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, they each have their own unique and distinct developmental trajectory, which unfolds in different regions and areas. For us, as young people living in today's world, I feel that although, in terms of the fundamental principles of the Dharma, they should be consistent without any differences, there are to some extent differences in their culture or methods of transmission. There are more or less some distinctions. What I would like to ask you, Master, is how can we better understand the true reasons and commonalities that exist behind these differences? How can we better integrate these two traditions well enough in our own personal daily study? I would like to ask the Master more details about this.
I actually share some of the very same feelings and thoughts as you. Personally, I myself have been studying Tibetan Buddhism, but I'm also genuinely very interested in learning more about Chinese Han Buddhism as well. So in this way, I think it's not just the two of us who share this particular trait. Moreover, in contemporary society, many people, including those who do not believe in Buddhism, although they are not true followers themselves, they often have some understanding of Buddhism. I think that now, because humanity has entered such an open era, in this open era, it is very necessary for us to be looking at some of the traditions, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism, at seminars mainly based on the theoretical system of Tibetan Buddhism, or when we hold some forums at such times, it is very necessary to invite some scholars, masters, and great teachers from Chinese Han Buddhism to engage in dialogue and joint exploration of the doctrines of Tibetan Buddhism and Chinese Han Buddhism together, and to have discussions and explore together. It is also necessary within Chinese Han Buddhism to invite some prominent figures, mainly from Tibetan Buddhism, such as great teachers, scholars, experts, and so on, to jointly discuss certain topics around some themes. Because now is not like the time before the 1970s and 1980s. Back in the 1970s and 1980s, whether in the East or West, including in business and commerce, all cultures were largely isolated from each other for centuries. Before Western culture was introduced to the East, it's fair to say that many Western ideas were almost all completely unknown here. But now it's a completely different era. In this kind of era, Buddhism should be centered on the principle of do no evil, practice all good. And if we focus on such a core and principle, I think it is very necessary for all of humanity, as we all share common interests. Of course, each has its own unique characteristics. For example, in Chinese Han Buddhism, throughout the generations of eminent monks and great masters, some studied Pure Land, some studied Chan, and some studied the Huayan school. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are major schools such as Gelug, Kagyu, and Nyingma, each one with its own unique doctrines and distinct historical backgrounds. But overall, in general, their fundamental philosophies are highly consistent. Moreover, this kind of philosophy is exactly what humanity needs now: truth, goodness, and beauty. In this regard, people especially need the awareness and the important concepts that religion provides, which are essential for many individuals.
Venerable Master, I study Tibetan Buddhism at the Institute of World Religions, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I have a question for you. Nowadays, the propagation of Tibetan esoteric Buddhism is extremely popular in the mainland. It's as popular as it was in the 1930s in the mainland. However, Tibetan Buddhism has always upheld a certain principle, that is, without the exoteric school, one cannot attain the true path of Buddhism. Without esoteric school, one cannot achieve ultimate fruition in Buddhism. What is your view on the current situation, where so many tulkus from Tibetan region are widely performing empowerments in the mainland, as well as transmitting teachings in this manner? Shouldn't more Tibetan Buddhist masters be guiding people in the cultivation of the two accumulations of merit and wisdom, extensively practicing virtuous deeds to benefit sentient beings, and enhancing wisdom to benefit oneself? I'm not sure if my understanding is correct. I would appreciate your guidance, Master.
I think that indeed there are quite a lot of people in the mainland now who are studying Tibetan Buddhism. As I mentioned earlier in my talk with everyone, there are two levels to this. On one level, some people are rather superstitious. Some of them don't know what a guru is, what a tulku is, or what a great master is. As soon as they hear about an empowerment or a dharma transmission, they rush in without investigate. They really don't know where it originally comes from or exactly just what lineage it belongs to. None of that. Perhaps there has always been a considerable portion of people like this. Whether they're interested in Tibetan Buddhism or other religions, today they study Christianity, tomorrow Taoism, and the day after that, Tibetan Buddhism. A few days later, they stop studying altogether. There's also this kind of group. According to the theory of Tibetan Buddhism, this approach is not particularly suitable or even really appropriate, because to establish a relationship between a guru and a disciple, one must go through a process of careful and thoughtful observation before forming such a connection with each other. There is also a much more simple rational aspect to consider, because nowadays in many places in the Han region, including among some intellectuals, they especially need a kind of spiritual support. This kind of spiritual support is now very hard to find elsewhere. Yet, it just so happens that specifically within Tibetan Buddhism, as I just mentioned, there is a well-established and comprehensive theoretical framework in place, combined with some practical methods for cultivation. So as a result, people are like someone who is very hungry and happens to come across something especially delicious, and the quality of it is also up to standard. In this way, it suits them perfectly. So quite a number of people indeed, as far as I know. There are tens of thousands of people nowadays. They are studying in a very systematic, dedicated, and genuinely earnest way. And after studying, they also enter the proper path of Buddhism. This does exist as well. So regarding these two aspects, perhaps we cannot generalize. We should analyze them from both perspectives. At the same time, as you just mentioned, without studying the exoteric school, one cannot attain the right path. Without studying the esoteric school, one cannot achieve realization. In fact, this is a statement from certain scriptures, actually, whether one studies the exoteric or esoteric schools. Ultimately, in the highest sense, they are all integrated and interconnected. There is no contradiction at all. In fact, they complement and enhance each other. If you attain the highest fruition in the exoteric school, then you also attain the highest fruition in the esoteric school. Some of the highest attainments in the esoteric school, in fact, cannot be achieved if the exoteric school is not fully realized.
Master, may I ask another question? At present, in the mainland, many masters have come to teach these preliminary practices with great compassion. What exactly does the so-called preliminary practice mainly include? Is it mainly about specifically reciting mantras, performing mudras, and reciting heart mantra? I want to know more about these three aspects. regarding the various preliminary practices. For example, some people are teaching Dzogchen and others are teaching things like the Kala Chakra, etc. But what exactly are these so-called preliminary practices that they often talk about? And in fact, many lay practitioners are regularly practicing the preliminaries. Sometimes I feel that people living in the mainland are not quite as fortunate as others. We still have relatively little direct contact with high lamas from Tibetan region. And because of the language barrier, the differences between the mainland and Tibetan region are especially great. Then many people in the mainland, even many lay practitioners over time, have spent quite a lot of money to make offerings to certain highly respected lamas, and in fact perhaps they have gained a great deal from doing so. But from our perspective, we feel that they have actually gone astray. So how should we guide everyone towards proper faith? Thank you.
Well, I think that what is often described as the actual preliminary practice is actually not quite exactly the same as you just understood it. As someone who studies Tibetan Buddhism, you should further observe the differences between preliminary and main practices. You may need to look into it more deeply before making a judgment, because preliminary practices are divided into common and uncommon preliminaries. For example, with the common preliminaries, the most basic requirement when learning Vajrayana Buddhism is to understand things like the rarity of human life, the impermanence of life, the suffering of samsara, and the infallibility of karma and its effects. As for the uncommon preliminaries, they include taking refuge, generating bodhicitta, confession, and so on. These are basically the same across all of Tibetan Buddhism, with only minor differences among the major schools and traditions. So I personally think that these preliminary practices are actually absolutely essential and very important to study and understand. Preliminary practices are not a unique practice exclusive to Tibetan Buddhism. They should be considered a foundation of Buddhism as a whole. If you skip the preliminaries and try to jump straight to the higher teachings, whether it's in Tibetan Buddhism or Chinese Han Buddhism, no one will succeed in their practice that way. So I think that actually in Tibetan Buddhism, there are some very systematic teachings that whether you are a practitioner of Chinese Han Buddhism, a Chinese layperson, or a Tibetan layperson, or even someone from a Western country, it doesn't matter who you are. As long as you receive some systematic knowledge, it should be possible. Actually, the preliminaries are, in worldly terms, quite similar to what we might call preschool education, or perhaps even elementary school level courses. They're very simple, very basic courses, and that's what we call the preliminaries. Of course, as you just mentioned, there are some individuals whose contributions may not actually benefit themselves at all. But in this particular small regard, we really can't simply make sweeping generalizations. There are some individuals who make offerings to truly great masters and genuine teachers. Whether in Chinese Han or Tibetan Buddhism, if he makes offerings based on his own faith and personal sincere belief, we can't just sit here and make a quick plan to decide that he's gone astray. Of course, if he encounters a false teacher, someone who doesn't have the qualifications of a true master, then regardless of which ethnicity the teacher belongs to, it is indeed quite inappropriate. I mentioned this earlier as well, just to clarify. According to the genuine methods of relying on and carefully examining a teacher in Tibetan Buddhism, the standards are extremely strict, but now things have become commercialized. It's quite possible that a very small number of people in Tibetan Buddhism who are not qualified as masters have started to actively promote their own various teachings. Some lay practitioners who lack sufficient wisdom and do not fully meet the qualifications of a true disciple may offer their hard-earned money and later come to regret it. This kind of situation does exist. But this is an individual's action. If we take these isolated individual actions, we cannot use them to judge the overall subtle relationship between Tibetan Buddhism or Han Chinese Buddhists. For every matter, we should have a relatively unique and special way of looking at and observing it so that we can eventually be able to find its true point of synthesis.
Venerable Master, from what perspective should we exactly judge whether a master is a virtuous and qualified teacher? What are the main aspects that can help ordinary lay practitioners who don't know much, or people like us who have never been exposed to tantric practice or study? How can we determine whether someone is a qualified and virtuous master? From which aspects should we start? Thank you.
I've actually talked about this topic many times before, including what you just mentioned earlier about the preliminary practices. I delivered 144 lectures on it. Among them, It also includes that a true master must have genuine wisdom. He must be well versed in both the exoteric and esoteric Buddhist scriptures and treatises, and also be thoroughly familiar with the teachings he imparts. At the same time, he must possess genuine compassion and be free from any kind of attachment to wealth and possessions. There are also quite a few important but very basic criteria regarding the characteristics of relying on a spiritual teacher.
Venerable Master, I would like to ask you a question. What do you think is the meaning of life? And how do you, in your view, understand happiness? Thank you.
I think that the meaning of life should be to truly live in this world in the most meaningful way possible. Of course, the meaning of life is different for everyone. For some people, having a happy family is the meaning of life. For some people, benefiting those around them is truly the meaning of life. But I think there are many different levels to the meaning of life. The highest meaning of life is to be able to help others. As for happiness, I believe that a person feels truly happy when they experience a sense of fulfillment. And this sense of fulfillment comes when one truly recognizes its value. That is when one is truly happy. It's only when it is gone that we realize, I was actually very happy, but I didn't recognize it at the time. So I always felt true happiness is about having a sense of fulfillment and recognizing it.
Hello, Khenpo. I am a doctoral student from Minzu University of China. It is a pleasure to meet you. I'm studying Tibetan Buddhism. My current research focus is on the Nyingma school. I have a question, which is that some people say the Chan school of Chinese Han Buddhism has had some significant impact on the Dzogchen teachings of the Nyingma school. How does Khenpo view this?
In fact, in our history, during the era of Kamalashila, Moheyan from the Chan school actually made his own way and came over to the entire Tibetan region. At that time, he also widely shared and promoted the doctrine of sudden enlightenment. That is to say, one should neither do good nor do evil, just remain quietly abiding in a state of calm, and simply speaking, that's enough. At that time, many Tibetan monasteries originally had traditions like offering lamps and burning incense. These gradually disappeared. Later, after some debates, Moheyan left the Tibetan region. Afterwards, people had different accounts written down in various old historical records. Some people might say that at the time, they actually felt that Moheyan's views were generally to be viewed as and considered somewhat heretical. So he couldn't remain in the Tibetan region, and the great masters of the Nyingma school eventually drove him out. Some others say that at that time, Tibetan Buddhism was in a rather superficial psychological state, so they simply couldn't easily accept the especially profound Chan teachings from that period back then. But later, some real historians, including the most authoritative figure in the Nyingma school, Venerable Longchenpa, whose most famous treatises are the Seven Treasuries. Within them, there is a text called the Treasury of the Ultimate Reality. In the Treasury of the Ultimate Reality, it is stated that the views of Moheyan were simply not accepted by some seekers at the time, as their beliefs and ways of thinking were already firmly established. In other words, his views were reasonable and made sense, but at that time, people just could not accept these teachings, as they were not ready to embrace such new ideas. In fact, they were simply too profound. That's the point. Later, when the great masters of the Nyingma school analyzed this process, because of the sudden enlightenment approach in Moheyan, you may have studied the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, which includes both gradual and sudden enlightenment methods. The gradual method promoted by Shengxiu's side is relatively easy to understand, and even the emperors of China at that time were more accepting of it. But the sudden enlightenment method allows one to settle the mind in an instant. This was Master Huineng, the Sixth Patriarch himself. When he first began to rely on the Fifth Patriarch, it was especially suitable for him. So now, personally, I think that this Chan school method for the Nyingma school, you might have felt embarrassed to say it, that it didn't have a positive influence. You only mentioned an influence without actually saying or really specifying whether it was good or bad. I understand your thinking. But actually, this was indeed the sudden enlightenment method at that time. For those at the level of gradual learners, it's not very suitable. Because if you study step by step and are given a particularly profound method right at the beginning, it's hard to accept if it's transmitted to you directly. Actually, what the Chan school teaches is completely correct. However, at that time, some people didn't follow the gradual stages. If you don't follow the stages and let anyone relax directly, as I mentioned earlier, it might not be very suitable. It's not for gradual enlightenment followers, but it's for sudden enlightenment followers. That's why, at that particular time in history, such a truly historic conflict occurred. Actually, the true principles of Chan Buddhism and the Dzogchen of the Nyingma school, I have also specifically done some research in this area, should be said to be very much in accord with each other.
Hello, Khenpo. I am also from Minzu University of China, and I am currently studying Tibetan Buddhism. I am also a Buddhist. I feel especially honored today being able to communicate with you face to face, because I've seen it before, your prior conversation with Master Jikun. These are some questions about Tibetan Buddhism. Master Jikun actually asked you a question and you offered several thoughtful answers. At that time, you also explained many things that I didn't understand about Tibetan Buddhism. I also recommended it to some friends, which helped dispel their misunderstandings about Tibetan Buddhism. So I have always held you in great esteem. Coming here today, I actually do not have many academic questions to ask. However, I do have a recent question regarding vegetarianism. This is because I personally also advocate for vegetarianism, and I often find myself discussing it with some of my friends. But, as is often the case, some people have raised doubts about it to me. One type is like those from the academic community. They believe that vegetarianism didn't actually exist during the Buddha's time. They say that in the Buddha's era, people didn't strictly follow a vegetarian diet either. Instead, they would eat whatever food they gratefully received as alms. If there was meat, they would eat meat. They claim that the tradition of vegetarianism in China originated from Emperor Wu of Liang. It was only after Emperor Wu of Liang promoted vegetarianism that it began. I really want to refute this viewpoint, but I also don't know whether what they're saying is actually correct. There's another viewpoint. This is, people ask why vegetarian? I say animals feel pain. They say, what about plants? They feel pain too. I say plants probably don't because they're not sentient beings. They say, how do you know they don't feel pain? You're not a plant. Some people have even told me that plants are sentient beings too and participate in the 6 realms of reincarnation. You mentioned the world of sentient beings and material objects. I thought plants belonged to material objects, not sentient beings. But after hearing others say this, I started to feel that I don't really have a solid Buddhist theory to actually refute them at this point. So today, I'd like to again ask for your clear guidance. Thank you.
All right. Your 2 questions about vegetarianism. Actually, during the Buddha's time, although the Theravada scriptures mentioned that Buddhists would eat whatever food they were given while going on their daily alms rounds, and even now, some Theravada monastic communities still continue to follow this traditional practice. This approach has been maintained for many generations. But in the end, the Buddha already stated in the Lankavatara Sutra and the Nirvana Sutra that what he had previously said about the 3 kinds of pure meat was actually not the ultimate teaching, and that it was unreasonable. That was only for those just entering Buddhism at the beginning. It was to guide people according to their capacities. In principle, it seems the Buddha never actually permitted eating meat. This is stated in the Mahayana scripture, the Lankavatara Sutra, because the Buddha's true intention is actually found in the Mahayana Sutras. It's like how the curriculum in elementary and middle school isn't very complete, but the university curriculum can be said to be the most complete. When you read animal stories in elementary school, some of them may not be true. It's only when you get to university that things are actually true. So in the Mahayana curriculum, there is a clear distinction between eating meat and being vegetarian. The Buddha made this very clear. It's stated very clearly in the Lankavatara Sutra. This is entirely a core principle of Mahayana Buddhism as taught by the Buddha. It should be understood in this way. Moreover, in any Mahayana scripture, the Buddha never permitted eating meat. It was only permitted in the Hinayana tradition. But this permission was later clearly and explicitly refuted when it came to the Mahayana teachings. The reason for this prohibition is also specifically because it brings suffering to sentient beings. And just now you mentioned the difference between plants and animals. I've talked about this elsewhere before. Actually, when it comes to plants, although from a botanical perspective, plants are considered a form of life nowadays, this kind of life only reacts under different conditions of sunlight, water, and certain causes and conditions. It merely has some reactions, that's all. In reality, it does not truly experience feelings of suffering or happiness. This point is discussed in Buddhist scriptures, such as the Shurangama Sutra. Sentient beings possess the 5 aggregates, whereas plants do not have the 5 aggregates. The Buddha had already answered this particular question very clearly a long time ago. Therefore, you cannot include plants among animals. That is completely unreasonable. The life of a plant is simply a kind of reaction, not true sentient life as we understand it. It does not actually possess the 5 aggregates. Although we are, in fact, not vegetative people, we still know that, at least in theory, this should be very clear and unambiguous. Therefore, this belongs to the world of material objects, to the category of insentient, non-living phenomena. If all plants were considered to have life, that would also be quite unreasonable. This is analyzed very clearly in the systematic study of Buddhism. So when you kill animals, animals are indeed just like us, sentient humans. They actually experience both pleasure and pain. But plants do not really have such a very complex kind of life. Of course, from the perspective of environmental protection, it is also necessary to protect plants. But this is simply and entirely different from the issue of life itself, really.
Hello, Master. I study microbiology in the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I'm studying the Bodhicitta. I feel that I should personally integrate the Buddhist knowledge I have learned into my own personal life and daily activities. I currently have a question that I would like to ask. I am currently engaged in basic scientific research at this time, but sometimes I think if I do this my whole life, it might not necessarily bring much real long-term benefit to humanity overall, or solve any truly significant problems for everyone. So I would like to ask you, how can I, in my work, seek or cultivate my own bodhicitta, perhaps even nurture it in my daily life?
Even the Chinese Academy of Sciences has bodhicitta. That's definitely quite possible. First of all, I really do admire you now for so diligently studying the profound text of Bodhicitta, because the Bodhicitta is a way to spread more genuine love among the humanity. In this modern world, it really has an incredible kind of transformative effect and inner power. Of course, as a researcher, you may often wonder what kind of benefit you can bring to humanity in your lifetime. I think it doesn't necessarily have to be very closely related to your research or your work. In fact, whether in the daily process of living or starting a new business, as long as a person truly possesses a genuinely loving and compassionate heart, that is willing to help and support others in need, that is always deeply meaningful and significant to the whole of humanity. For example, take myself as an example. Even though I don't have a particularly wide or extensive range of social contacts, I still have colleagues and family members who are always around me, including some animals that I interact with regularly. If I truly possess a genuinely selfless spirit of dedication and love, then these qualities will naturally be reflected in my actions and relationships. I can offer this love to them at any given time. In this way, actually, your own love or your personal contribution may not necessarily be recorded in history as something particularly great or truly remarkable, but it still most certainly should be clearly noted in the underlying blueprint of our own inner consciousness or wisdom. In this way, I think many people will find that it's not about the actual magnitude of what you can do, but about the very pure intention and aspiration lying behind it. As long as you truly choose love in any given situation, even while simply walking out alone just on the street. Some time ago, there was a moving local news report about a little baby in Zhejiang. A child who was less than 100 days old was tragically run over by a car. Neither the hospital nor the doctors did anything at all about it. Not long ago, this incident was a hot topic on Weibo. Society simply ignores such cases. If you haven't registered, there is nothing that can be done. Actually, at that time, there were many people, including doctors, nurses, and even passers-by. They all had a responsibility, but everyone just shifted the blame. The morality of today's society, when it doesn't involve their own interests, no one cares. If this continues, society will become cold and indifferent, which is truly frightening. So I think that through a simple mindset of sincerely helping others and genuine altruism, it will always truly have such a very great and deep significance.
I am a first-year master's student in the Department of Religious Studies, researching Tibetan Buddhism. Just now, in your inspiring speech, you specifically mentioned the very important issue of happiness. Recently, there was also a happiness survey conducted in society. You have explained the concept of happiness before, but now, as time goes on, more and more people are living in cities, not in the remote places like your hometown. Though people in your hometown may have never actually taken an airplane or any form of modern technology in their lives, but they are very happy. So, in your opinion, for people living in today's society, how can they find their own sustainable happiness? How can ancient religion and our modern society be more effectively integrated in a way that works so everyone can find spiritual support for themselves? And there's another question. Many people believe in Buddhism. Some just recite the Buddha's name and burn incense worshipping the Buddha. But some people hold a skeptical attitude toward religion. If you ask them to believe in Buddhism, they will ask you a lot of questions. Only after resolving the doubts in their hearts will they be willing to believe in Buddhism. This process is a very lengthy and extended one. How can we find such wisdom so that more people can feel how Buddhism can help them in their lives and then ultimately find true happiness? Please help us explain this. Thank you.
Yeah. Many of you are currently studying Tibetan Buddhism, which is really great. I don't praise you simply because your study could promote Tibetan Buddhism. I never even thought about it that way. Whether it's a religion or a field of social science that can truly bring a real benefit to all humanity, then these things certainly also should be more fully, widely, and extensively promoted in our world. Anything that is not beneficial to our body and mind or society, whether it's a religion or any particular kind of worldly science, it really shouldn't be overly hyped. Otherwise, it becomes unhealthy for everyone. Of course, regarding your earlier question, one important aspect is about happiness, which, as I mentioned earlier, I actually just talked about. The poor conditions in our area are not the fundamental reason for happiness. The main thing I know is that they all actually have a deep kind of faith. This faith is actually a fundamental cause of people's long-term mental health. However, we must realize that not everyone in the Tibetan region is necessarily a devout Buddhist. Some time ago at West China Hospital, we recently found a Tibetan young person who was suffering severely from depression. At the time, the doctor simply said, "Since you are Tibetan, but maybe it is because you don't yet have much faith in Tibetan Buddhism, you've been assimilated, so you developed depression." They had never actually encountered a Tibetan person with depression before at any point in their lives. I really feel quite strongly about this point. Indeed, in our area, so-called depression or suicide due to emotional reasons, these things just don't exist. Because everyone knows, for example, if a relationship between two people isn't going well, they believe it's due to karma and impermanence. Everyone says this and truly thinks this way in their hearts too. No matter what you do, if the karmic connection simply isn't there, then there's really nothing you can do about it at all. No matter what you do, when the right time eventually comes, impermanence will inevitably occur. So everyone can completely accept this reality. Therefore, I think that if we truly want to be happy now, myself included, I often find myself using something that the famous Shunji emperor once said when he finally became a monk. Gold and white jade are actually not truly precious. Only donning the monk's robe is the most difficult and valuable. He had this saying, which means gold and white jade are not that valuable or precious. Becoming a monk is the most precious thing. So I also think to myself, I have become a monk, and in my life, in many different ways, I am truly very happy. If you simply go with the flow in everything and just accept things as they come, you are especially happy. This is my own personal outlook on life and my values. As I mentioned earlier, many people nowadays are pursuing happiness. In fact, people really do need to have faith in their lives, but just having faith alone is not enough. One should understand what Buddhism teaches, whether it's impermanence or going with the flow, or the suffering that we experience in life, these various causes and conditions. When you truly understand these causes and conditions, then true happiness in life comes naturally. Some time ago, Bhutan became the small country with the highest happiness index in the world. Actually, back in the 1990s, I visited Bhutan. At that time, I also personally met King Sangye Wangchuk and had a very long conversation with him. As for their own faith there, almost the entire country sincerely practices and follows all the various teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. And they are especially devout in their beliefs. They don't need a lot of complex material things from the outside world and all sorts of things. Even now, they still strictly restrict foreign tourists from coming to their country. If you really want to stay there, it's at least $200 per day. That's just simply how their current policy. So I think people definitely need some basic material necessities from the outside world. But beyond that, they have a kind of true spiritual nourishment within themselves. In such special circumstances, people should surely feel genuinely happy in their own hearts. They probably won't ever experience any form of very great and overwhelming mental suffering. I feel that our happiness is related to our understanding of the various causes and conditions, impermanence, and so on as taught in Buddhism. These truths are very much connected to it. As for the second question, as you just mentioned, many people nowadays burn incense and worship Buddha, and some of them may also have doubts. Actually, we always particularly encourage all your sincere doubts. No matter if you're a Buddhist or anyone else, it's good to have some doubts at first. In Chan Buddhism, there's also the saying, great doubt leads to great enlightenment. No doubt, no enlightenment. Small doubt, small enlightenment. You first have all kinds of doubts, and then over a long period of time, you go to learn, to explore, to further strengthen and truly temper yourself. To see what Tibetan Buddhism is like and what Chinese Han Buddhism is like. Use your wisdom and heart to observe. In the end, through your observation, you will truly arrive at a very clear conclusion. At that time, whether you recite the Amitabha Buddha's name or practice Chan meditation, you will do so with real confidence. So as I just said, we first need to have a long-term process of observation. After a long period of observation, you will truly be able to reach a conclusion on your own at a certain point. At that time, whatever practice you choose will become much easier. Otherwise, as one teacher mentioned at the very beginning, you might just listen and get involved in a confused, muddled way. As you continue practicing at first, this is called definite understanding in Tibetan Buddhism. From the very beginning, you need to have a sense of determination. This sense of determination requires a certain amount of setbacks and obstacles. In the end, you will have unshakable faith and will never turn back. The same goes for reciting the Buddha's name. How should you do it? First, you need to understand the purpose of reciting the Buddha's name. Why do it and what effect does it have? You need to analyze its power, efficacy, blessings, and so on. Otherwise, many people's blind way of thinking ultimately leads to their own personal troubles, difficulties, and suffering.